The demise of an Irish clan. Chapter 6. End of the 9-Year War. Thomas O'Carey was killed by Cromwell's parliamentarian troops in 1654 at the burning of St. Fechin's Abbey. The monastery was an important monastic centre which was founded in AD 630 and later to become a small fortified town defended by 2 gates and a canal, a mound and a ditch. The monastery withstood several burnings and raids, eventually becoming an Anglo-Norman priory under the rule of the Order of St. Augustine. The last prior, William Nugent, surrendered the house and possessions to Henry VIII. The town of Fore allied to the English, being close to the English Pale. It was during the sacking of the Abbey in 1654 that the English parliamentarians, that Thomas's 3 sons, Thomas, who married Mary O'Brien of Naas, niece of Hugh O'Brien, Patrick and James, escaped and found refuge with Hugh O'Brien at Dublin, one of the Confederate Catholics. In the early 1600s, the O'Byrnes family owned vast estates around Clare, Naas, in Kildare and Wicklow. In 1653 and 1665, Leinster was one of the 4 equal land provinces of Ireland, made up by areas such as Kilkenny, assigned by the English Parliament as security for soldiers and adventurers. Carlow and Kildare retained as a government reservation, and Queen's an area included in the plantation of the Catholic James I. The throne of England was, after James II, occupied by Mary and William of Orange, hence Irish Protestants becoming Orangemen. This reign effectively destroyed the Catholic landowning classes. The aftermath of the Cromwellian plantation period found some Irish Catholic citizens selling up, others quite demented by worry, some running away and others executed. The transportations completed finally in July 1655. There were many arrests for failing to transplant, in fact so many that the jails were full. Hangings made spaces available until an excuse was made to let some go. Those picked on were landowners, not the landless. A few years later some of the new owners sold up to others who increased their grants by purchase to become the new gentlemen. It was generally a clearance of the old landowners, and even in the Restoration things were never the same again. The old ways in Kilkeary superseded. Some old freeholders went to Irish counties, whilst others went abroad, mainly to Spain and Holland, away from the English influence, changing their names and making a fresh start. And by this time the clan was almost non-existent. In the Civil Survey of 1654 to 1656, the parish of Kilkeary, spelt K-Y-L, K-E-R-R-Y, showed even at this late stage spellings were not regularised. It also suggests that the parish was considerably larger, containing several townships and parcels of land. The parish began at the ford and at the river of Gir, bounded with the parish of Kinnaneave, followed the river southwards, which adjoins Templedoney, Ballamackie, Greenostown and Lisbonny. The parish was described in the survey as having good arable meadows and pastures, several springs and a number of ploughlands. The Heath money rolls indicated that several members of the family living in County Tipperary started to use the English form of Carey, spelt with a C, to retain their estates. They were better off under the Restoration settlement, for they received back 3/5 of their land. That was before the 1691 Jacobite War, and by the end they had even less. Those of the family who retained their Gaelic native Irish name lived outside Clonmell's walls. Many of the old gentry, including the O'Carey and the O'Kennedys, had been evicted from their estates. In exchange they had been given fractions, huts to live in, where they had to stay without possessions. One of the clans, the O'Kennedys of Ormond, had their fractions confiscated by the Williamite Wars, because 48 of the clan families wished to maintain their Gaelic inheritance, and this didn't go down well with the Anglo-Irish, who expected them to conform. Other families related to the old gentry hid under another name for fear of losing what little they had managed to retain. The O'Carey and the O'Kennedys were not the only clans to live by deception. It's clear that few of the old families realigned back to their former allegiances. They hadn't been happy under the previous relationships and wanted to make a change, and some of the elderly stayed at home and worked for their new masters, tilling their own land. Others, wishing to leave, were allotted land in Connaught. In Ormond, the more adventurous gentry took refuge in the inaccessible valleys of Glen Cahoill, between the Slieve Felim hills, where their descendants still carried their dead to be buried in the churchyard at Kilkeary. In 1659, Kilkeary, in the barony of Upper Ormond, held 769 households, with a population of about 4,000 persons. Kilkeary was a direct grantee land made over to the new sitting owner, James Dalton. Some years later, during the Restoration period, some of the transferred settlement land was shared, in some cases bought back by the old landowners. These old landowners include the O'Meara, the O'Connors, and Charles and Anthony O'Carroll. Catholics held 20% of land in Kilkeary, Tumavara and Nina, and this percentage became reduced during the 1700s. In Petty's census of 1659, the O'Carey made up the largest percentage living in the baronies of Skryne, County Meath and Ballybrit, South Offaly. The Macaires of Molycashel, barony, Westmeath were also in abundance. Ireland was still massively a Catholic population, ruled and given their laws by an Anglo-Irish hierarchy. The country's link to Rome gave it its cultural base allied to the continent through the Irish colleges in France, the Italian military academies, and those businesses engaged in overseas. To the English, the Irish appeared a threat, even though Ireland was a poorer cousin. The Irish population in 1690 was now nearly 2 million, and growing. Limerick was a prosperous seaport and used as a bastion against British influence. It was the last to hold out. The Jacobites used the town and its river to retreat to. Limerick's city walls held, but only just. William confiscated all the land belonging to those Catholics who later escaped to France. The result of the defeat was the Treaty of Limerick in 1691. It was the third great defeat. Thomas and Bridget Carey of Legbourne in 1692 saw the defeat of the Catholic cause. A number of families allowed retaining their property, if considered docile enough. Accepting English law, however, all Catholics were subject to penal laws. This eldest son of Thomas Braintreadhachd, Thomas O'Carey, had 3 sons. Thomas the elder died in Spain 9 years later. Patrick, who escaped from Limerick at the same time, entered Spanish service in the military, and Hugh, who married Margaret O'Brien, daughter of Dermot O'Brien of Naas. Their son, John O'Brien, married Mary, daughter of Owen MacEwen of Clontarf and Swords. Their second child was a daughter born in 1749, who married in 1780 Hugh O'Moore of Longford, Castle Pollard, in the county of Westmeath. The whole family were Catholics and held Gaelic allegiances to language and habit. At that time, There were a number of landowning and public office acts that restricted the rights of Catholics, prevented them from assuming state office and property. If an individual wished to get on, improve his lot, he had to go where there was money to be made, skills to be passed on, and property to be bought. And that goal could only be accomplished by appearing to adopt the Protestant religion, using a name translated into English and adopting a more recognisable English name. And this was the start of the O'Keary spelling being given up, and the more English C or K used to form the spelling Carey. And by adopting these changes, a move then made either to live in a settlement area or to find a new life abroad. In the diocese of Killaloe, which included Kilkeary, there were only a few beneficed clergymen, less who actually resided in the area. There were about 3 Catholic priests to 1 clergyman. Churches were not maintained, allowing rotting roofs and broken walls to let in the damp and rain. This state, the paucity of the clergyman, also affected other church property, including glebe houses. Idleness was also recorded when it came to tithe collecting and ministering to the parishioners. There was an exodus from the countryside, as there were few opportunities for the ambitious and capable. The landowners patronised the tenant fathers who, at one time, had been self-supporting, now relied upon handouts and loans because of the potato blight. The problems were so acute that stealing crops was carried out, to survive and prevent children starving. Not long before, generations of families had lived in harmony together, populating land not belonging to them with the knowledge that they would not be evicted. This was not the only time the English Parliament had taken their land away from them. The O'Keary family had lost much in the confiscations, but some poor land kept as insurance. For harsher times ahead, Irish politicians blamed the depressed state of the economy to English restrictions on Irish trade. The poverty of the rural economy was blamed on those who maintained pasturage instead of promoting the growth of seed and potatoes. And this put down to the shortness of tenures. Farmers were not allowed to think long-term, for it was a hand-to-mouth existence. The local opinion was opposed to that of Dubliners who under the threat of quarterage tax. This tax was about people who wished to pursue the profession or trade, but for whatever reason, usually because they upheld the old Gaelic traditions, were thereby excluded from membership of the relevant guild. The annual pilgrimage to Loch Derg still went on, although forbidden by law. The church, too, also frowned upon these acts of piety, much to the chagrin of the local population who benefited from the additional circulating cash. Economic fluctuations prompted by taxation, which upset the normal domestic industry, particularly the cost of seed, potatoes, and livestock, created unrest. Rebellion was in the air, and tensions increased in rural areas, releasing sectarian antipathies. There was a general collapse of Protestant morale, for looking towards the Catholic majority, they were outnumbered. There were several threats, both real and imaginary, of invasion, rebellion, and insurrection coming from France and Spain. Tenant farmers, working from small farms in the diocese of Killaloe, mainly produced vegetables and corn. Larger farms grazed cattle. Leases could last for up to 40 years. Farmers made their own repairs and improvements, draining the land and rotating their crops. The landowners made sure their land was occupied so that land didn't lie waste and become overgrown. When a farm became vacant, the new lease ran according to periods of prosperity or want. In times of plenty they were short-term, the results being tenants not taking a long-term view of their future by planning ahead. keeping back some of their produce to use as next year's seed. Nor did they have a planned rotation of crops, or devise ways to improve the drainage by digging ditches and drains. And if you can't foresee a future, you might just as well live for the present.